It is now my very great pleasure to introduce our second speaker of the morning, Richard Padley. Richard is the chairman and founder of Semantico, an award-winning specialist software company supplying identity, access management, and digital publishing solutions for publishers and information providers. Prior to founding Semantico in 1999, Richard worked for Macmillan, where he developed the first multi-volume online reference works and built article workflow tracking systems and XML content management software. Richard's academic background is in computer science, and he lives in Brighton. Richard?
Thank you. So I'll just get this set up. Okay, we're good. So, who had to use a username or a password to sign into something today? Yeah, I thought so. Good, good. And just spinning that theme out a little bit further. I mean, who's got more than one user account? More than 2? More than 4? More than 8? More than 16? Okay, we're getting there. More than 32? Way. Okay. So we're going to talk about a couple of things this morning. First of all or second of all, really, is the point which is on the title of my slide, which is providing a single sign-on service for scholars. And first of all is how new web standards can be applied to solve access problems. And thank you, Heather, for setting me up on the kind of identity access management piece. That's very helpful. I think we've got a good background there. So there's partly going to be a little bit of theory and a little bit of practice is what I'm saying here. So, we're going to talk a little bit about how some of the standards that are in play can help us with problems, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we use those standards at Semantico with our identity access management product, SAMS. Now, first of all, I think, having said that there's a problem, you might well want to ask me, well, what is that problem? And I'm going to say that, I still think that in our industry, the route to get to content is too hard. You'll have heard this a few times but I think it's a point that we still haven't maybe completely understood properly. So I wanted to say it very loud. The number of clicks is too damn high, to borrow from Jimmy Macmillan there. And again, don't get me wrong. This isn't me banging on a standard and saying that the standard is defective and that we have to have it. There has to be a better way to do this. But I thought I would just step through one of the scenarios. Now, you might have, when Heather was talking earlier about federated federations and not federated federations, identity federations, you might all be more familiar with the word shibboleth, which I think try not to use in the sense that it's very confusing for users. Who isn't familiar with shibboleth in the sense of not understanding? Okay, good. So I don't need to really explain. Shibboleth is federated identity for the one person that wasn't familiar with it. It's a federated identity standard. So, I mean, let's just look at where we might be. I'm on a set of Google search results. I'm doing some research. Maybe I'm doing some research for a paper I'm writing, and I follow that link through from the search results. And really, under an ideal scenario, I get access straight away. But the fact is that under many scenarios, it's access denied. And then I have to think, well, what do I do next? I know, I need to find a link that says login via my institution, and then I get asked where I'm from. At that point, I have to select maybe from a long list of institutions where I'm from. I need to put my username and password into that dance. I then need to go back to where I was, whichever publisher site it was, search for the content yet again, and then I can follow a link and get access. So there's too many clicks in there. And what's happening with too many clicks is we're losing users along the way. And when we're losing users along the way, we're kind of effectively devaluing our content. In fact, in many ways, we're damaging our publishing brand. We're maybe damaging publishing altogether by actually making it so hard to access. And then you get things like Sci-Hub that come along that make it super easy to access. So we've really got to solve this problem. And it's particularly a problem for mobile devices because, let's face it, nobody wants to be, repeatedly entering usernames and passwords on mobile devices. One of the big publisher sites that I looked at when I was putting these slides together, you know, there were more than 3,000 institutions to choose from when we were selecting this so-called "Where are you from?" It's sometimes called WAIF. I'm going to use a few acronyms here, but not too many. And, you know, well, how have we dealt with this, I suppose? You know, how have we dealt with this in the past? Well, one of the things we said is, well, we need some user education. We need in the library community, we need to tell users how to do this, because this is special somehow. Our users are different, they're academic, they need to be told how to, you know, in this case, ride the bicycle slightly differently. But actually, that's not the case. No one's interested in learning how to use the web in a different way. They just want to get on with their lives and access content. So the solution is not better user education. Here's what I'm just going to talk about for a minute, which is the kind of idea that we're sort of proliferating usernames and passwords, and those people that said that they had more than 32 or 64 user accounts will definitely be nodding their heads at this point. So I kind of just took top 6 kind of journal hosting platforms out there and just had a quick look, and all of them allow you to log in with a username and password. That's great. But is it? Because they're all different, of course. Every single one is a different username and password scheme that you're going to need that applies to that particular publisher. And that means that, you know, you can't have a way of signing on in one place, which then lets you access these multiple platforms. And that, you know, ultimately is going to drive traffic down for the same reason that we were talking about a few moments ago. Because if you know, effectively, if we're, you know, meaning that users have to keep on signing back in, you know, and this is a scenario when we look at how users are using content on mobile devices outside of the kind of traditional campus-based access which works with IP addresses, we need to solve this problem. Imagine if you could stay signed on. You know how you use Google? When you sign into Google and then that's kind of it. Every so often it might remind you to sign in again, but it's not very often, and you can go between a whole bunch of different properties that are all run by Google with that same identity, and you don't have to keep signing back on. Imagine how good that would be. So this is about saying, you know, that we need to think a little bit more carefully about how this access process works. You know, just hold that in your mind a moment, the idea that we you know, that if we had a single sign-on, what that might enable. And from here, we can, you know, what I'm trying to talk about here is that, you know, if we know who the individual is, then we can see what their individual entitlements are. Now, that's great, but we know that that's not the main business model that we're interested in. It's certainly an important business model and one that we shouldn't forget in the kind of bigger picture thing. So that's my kind of green circle over there that talks about individual entitlements. But more important than that are, well, what are the connections that this individual has to organisations? You know, am I a student at that organisation? Am I a researcher at that? Am I, you know, am I a publisher that's working for an organisation? Is my organisation connected to other organisations? I kind of left that off the bottom because that's sort of made this even more complicated. But it's these connections, I've called them affiliations, and they're kind of broken down into 2 bits. What I call explicit affiliations, that's definitely we know you're a student here. We definitely know you're a researcher here. Maybe that's been pushed through from ORCID so that you've got an assertion from your organisation itself that says, yes, these are our researchers. And then I've split those into another group which I call implicit affiliations. That's kind of what we use in the industry where we think about IP addresses or proxy servers or other ways of just kind of guessing, effectively, where your affiliations are. That's how we get it to work. You know, this is the kind of trick, if you like, in the past, where you're sitting in the campus, you access the resource, and it's just magically there. You didn't have to do anything. That's because we sort of made this judgment that said, well, you're coming from that IP address, you've got some kind of association with that organisation, you're good to go. We'll give you the green bits at the bottom, which are the big subscription resources normally that you're talking about, that you're after in order to get that paper that you wanted and to get on with your piece of research. Now, under many circumstances, we don't really ever know or need to know about individual users. And this is a kind of privacy point as well. So it's kind of, and it's important to kind of hold that as true. So we might well have what we think of as a guest user, but typically we would want to associate them still with the organizational entitlements which they're allowed to have. But imagine now, back to what I said a moment ago, if you've got a single sign-on system and some users are identified in that system, they can pull along all of the other things that their rights and entitlements with them all the time. And so they don't need to, you can give them all of the content that they're entitled to. So, which means that when they hit Google Scholar, go back to my original scenario, they can get the content straight away. So, what standards exist that might help us address this? And this is where I'm going to talk about OpenID Connect for a few moments. This is a standard that was developed by Google and Microsoft and Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and a whole bunch of very, very big B2C web companies who've got an enormous stake in the identity business. This is a kind of probably what Heather would call an ad hoc standard, I guess, in the sense that it's not officially kind of a standards body document, but it does rest on something which is an IETF standard, which is called OAuth. Now, that's neither here nor there in the sense that this is a very well-developed standard. It's used, as I say, by the biggest names. So when I said, you know how it is when you sign into Google, how it works, that's because they're using this piece of technology called OpenID Connect. So it's a very well thought out and very well developed standard. One of the things that this addresses is this, and I'll sort of just kind of, this is for really just for a moment. This idea of the password anti-pattern. Who's heard of anti-patterns? Okay, that's good. It's a really geeky phrase, so I wouldn't have expected you necessarily to know what it is. The idea is that you really don't want to be giving your username and password out willy-nilly. Okay, so here we see a screen from a sharing site called Share This, and it's asking me for all kinds of usernames and passwords. That just feels bad, doesn't it? So OAuth in particular was developed to address this problem, to stop it happening. But there are other bits of this that are worth thinking about too. And so if you go back to my screen where I said, well, look, we've got 6 big journal hosting websites, and they're all got username and passwords. Storing usernames and passwords in the first place is kind of a responsibility. There's a big security issue there. Have you heard how many leaks of username and password data there have been? Not just recently, but there have been stacks. So if you're going to look after this data, you need to be thinking very carefully about how secure your systems are, how your policies mesh together to look after that data. And in fact, looking after username and password data at all is actually a bad idea, because every time we create another username and password that a user has to remember, that's putting up another barrier in the way of using a resource. And so what OpenID Connect does is it lets us, in effect, let that be somebody else's problem. Just in the same way that the federated identity that Heather was talking about earlier lets you have your source of identity being with maybe your home institution or maybe with a commercial provider. They're the ones who want to be looking after usernames and passwords. Ideally, let it be Google's problem. Let it be Twitter's problem. Why should it be our problem? We can have a scheme that lets us still identify users without needing usernames and passwords. So that's why it's the right way to go. So what is identity exactly? Let's not get too philosophical about this. From a kind of, for our sort of technical purposes, what I'm interested in is that your identity, you may have several identities, and those identities are really just what I'm going to call sets of attributes. Attributes that could be things that tell you, my name, or my email address, or my shoe size, or you probably don't want to know that, but that's all attributes. And I might want to have several different identities. So I'm something that the computer can never see effectively. But the computer can see my identities by way of these different sorts of attributes that I can expose about myself. And OpenID Connect gives us a way of letting me select different identities to use with different websites. It also provides a bunch of other stuff that's provided in a standardized and interoperable way. So it lets me know who is the user that got authenticated. It lets me know where, when, and how she was authenticated. It lets me know what attributes she's willing to give out. And it lets me know why she's providing them. As I said, all in a standard and interoperable way. And finally, and this is, I'm going to just, there are a few kind of techie words in here. I think the point is, again, about being a standard. Obviously, we expect it to be interoperable. There are some kind of technical reasons why it's interoperable there. Mobile friendly and simple. Simple is an important one. We don't want to be, having to go and jump through massive hoops to implement this. From a software perspective, that's costly. We want to have drop-in libraries that we can just say, well, configure that, and it's done. We want it to be mobile friendly because, even though we may not be thinking about apps at the moment, we know that there's an entire app ecosystem out there, and apps need authentication just as much as websites do. We want it to be secure, as I said before. Security is incredibly important. And we need it to be flexible enough, and we need it to be flexible so that we can support maybe some of these kind of more unusual schemes that we actually use in our industry, things like IP address authentication, things like proxy authentication. And so we need the standard to have some extension mechanisms and extension points to support that. So that's OpenID Connect. Now I just want to spend a few minutes just telling you, how that applies to a product that we've been developing for more than 12 years now, which is our identity access management system. And we decided that a couple of years ago now, or about a year and a half ago, that we wanted to have a crack at solving this single sign-on problem because we saw that there's a big problem effectively with the way that we're addressing individual users in the scholarly community. And so we had a look, and we had a good look out there, and we decided that OpenID Connect was indeed a very useful standard and one that we could leverage to help us with this piece of development work. And it lets us identify customers simply and easily through single sign-on. It gives us that kind of property which I was talking about earlier, where we want users to be able to go straight from Google to a piece of content and access that without having to sign in. And when we talk about that on mobile, I've mentioned mobile a few times. Kind of one of the reasons I'm mentioning mobile a few times is we're looking at traffic here, and we're seeing that where all of the growth is happening is on mobile devices. Desktop devices, people aren't buying any more of those. The market's completely saturated, and people are spending more time on the web because they're spending more time through mobile devices. So getting mobile access right is absolutely critical to growing usage. And growing usage means growing customer base, it means growing revenues, it means supporting renewal cycles and being virtuous for the publishing business generally. So there's a kind of big thing here, which is this single sign-on. And I just wanted to talk about what that looks like. Because we talked about proliferation of identities. And so we've got a situation here where we've got a number of different user profiles. Some of these could be individuals. Many of them could actually be institutions. So when I've used the word profile, it's very deliberate there in the sense that I'm not just talking about an individual user. I'm thinking more in a more generic sense about an institutional usage as well. And so we can see here that Platform 1, it needs to know, obviously, all of the usernames and passwords and IP ranges and proxies and link resolvers and all the other bits of configuration that are to do with how you access the content that's on Platform 1. So it has its own database, effectively, which has got its own kind of set of identity information in. And then you see that Platform 2 knows all the usernames and passwords and IP ranges and proxies and link resolvers, and you can kind of see where this is going. Now, what happens if I want to change my username or password? I've got to update it in multiple places. Problem. Did I use the same username and password on all those services? How many people? No, I'm not even going to ask you, because I bet I know the answer. And frankly, who wouldn't? Because how are we supposed to remember so many usernames and passwords? That's what I talk about when I say the username and password anti-pattern. What I'm really thinking of there is we just proliferated this to such an extent. We've created a massive problem, which is we've got user accounts out there that we barely even remember that we registered with, probably using the same username and password that we used for something actually a hell of a lot more important. We need to stop this now. And this OpenID Connect is a great way of actually condensing that down so that we don't need to have all of these different sign-ons on different systems. Anyway, you can see what's happened now. We've got licenses and user data duplicated effectively n times across those different platforms there on the right-hand side. When I say no cross-platform synergy, what I mean there is, supposing those platforms are all operated by a single publisher, that's not unusual to see that you've got maybe you're you've got a membership platform that's more about services than it is about content, but it still needs to address the same set of users, or a subset of all of your users anyway. But those platforms, they can't see what's happening on each other. They don't know if you as an individual have got any right to access platform N when I'm on platform 2. So it can't contextualize my user experience and say, oh, by the way, there's some stuff over there that might be interesting for you to look at. So there's no synergy between the platforms. They're all individual islands. And then you have the poor user experience that I've been talking about all along. It's no good having to sign in multiple times. That kind of makes it difficult also to understand analytics, because analytics is spread liberally across the whole picture. And like I say, what happens if I want to change my IP address? If I'm a library and I've got a new business unit that's been opened, or else I've changed my internet service provider, I've got to change my IP address in all of those locations all at once. So it doesn't scale. So the solution is an identity platform that sits in the middle, but that gives from a publisher's perspective, it gives you a unified view of all the customers and all the agreements that you have with all of the customers. From the other side, from a library's perspective, it gives you, as a library or institution, a unified view of all your publisher agreements. It gives you the cross-platform single sign-on, multiple device, and it gives you that ability to unify the analytics and business intelligence. And so, and I'm not going to go into the technical detail now, so this is deliberately a kind of high-level talk. That's how we use the OpenID Connect software within our Sam Sigma product. Thank you very much. And the obligatory references at the end. Did you have any questions? Chris.
Hi, Richard.
Oh, by the way, there are some microphones, and actually, probably I would say, but can we have? Can you say your name and your organisation, just so that everybody knows?
Yeah, Richard Wynn, Aries Systems. Thanks for the presentation. I think everyone agrees with the statement of the problem. Interesting that Google is given as an example solution. So is that what the model for our industry will be, that the largest and biggest and meanest vendor is going to use the technology, the OpenID Connect, which again is fit for purpose, no doubt, but is it one commercial organization here that's going to drive this? Or is there a social organizational aspect to this where we're looking potentially for an independent group, a not-for-profit, to actually provide the social organization around this, using a technology like OpenID Connect? And I say this because we've implemented ORCID single sign-on across close to 4,000 journals across different publishers. You can use your ORCID ID, username and password to log in to journals from Springer to PLOS to many journals. And we never know that username and password, exactly like you explained it. It just uses the predecessor of OpenID Connect, OAuth 2, to do that. So isn't this a role for an external body to do this?
That's a great question. So I think obviously there's as you say, the technological aspect there is, and as a technologist, I can point to technology solutions and say this works. How there's a kind of almost a moral argument there where you're saying should we devolve control in that way to now? I mean, where's the control? I think first of all I'd have to say there's a question. control's actually happening it doesn't have to happen in a centralized sense. Just because Google is looking after a person's username and password, what we're asking Google to do is just look after one piece of identity. We're not necessarily saying that they're in control of anything other than that. Now, where ORCID sits in that, and I think it's an absolutely good point to ORCID, is that they could, there's a potential that could be the place we could look at as an industry for for that piece of responsibility. However, it's not really their mission. They're not really interested in identifying users in a general sense. I don't think they are anyway. I mean, I could easily stand corrected here, but in a general sense across the industry, they're interested in identifying researchers and contributors, specifically and principally speaking. Now, if they were interested in broadening their scope, that would be a fascinating conversation, and it's probably one that should happen. But those conversations don't come about unless we point to solutions that are out there and say, these are ways that we can solve this problem. Because for sure, and as you said, Richard, this is a real problem.
Yeah. The fact is that Google ORCID does use the same technology, OAuth and OpenID Connect, and to provide this solution, you do need a persistent identifier. So if we're saying it's not going to be ORCID, are we going to have someone else with another identifier? Are we going to use the Elsevier identifier or another large publisher's identifier so that we can give the user a seamless experience?
Again, I think from a technology perspective, it's not necessarily a binary choice like that. Go back to what Heather said earlier. This is inherently a system that supports federation. So there's no need for there to be a central player that is the source of all identity.
Yeah, but for federation to work seamlessly for the user, as you described it, there has to be a shared sense of identity. Otherwise, there's no federation, right? So you can't have it both ways. You can't say, I want to give users a seamless experience as they navigate between different resources, and then say, well, but I'm going to do that without having a shared ID for those people.
I think you can, but I think the reason you can is maybe is slightly more technical and slightly more complicated than, suffice to say that, the system that we've developed lets you still sign in with your Shibboleth ID if you want to, but then it remembers that connection and lets you use Sigma as the single sign-on across all of the platforms that it's wired into. So it's not the two things are not incompatible with each other.
So Sigma has a single identity for an individual?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's fine. I mean, I'm just saying there has to be to give a federated experience, you have to have somewhere someone needs to know that ID across multiple systems. But thank you.
Christian was next, and then, sorry, I'll take the next question. Christian, go ahead.
Yeah, Christian Cole, freelance consultant. So basically, Richard asked like most of the question I was going to ask. So if I understood you correctly, basically, SAM Sigma would be like Google for scholarly publishing. Then that's your ultimate master plan. And the second part of the question, there was a very interesting post this morning on the Scholarly Kitchen regarding like blockchain, and yeah, if you could comment on that.
Okay, so that's a different. I think I can't comment on the blockchain one because I actually think that that's wrong. And there's my short comment on the blockchain. I think that it's wrong, but I haven't had time to post a response on that blog. On the first question, which is the "Are we evil, Google?" No, of course I'm not going to say that. I don't think Google's all evil anyway. But equally, I think this is. And I'll go back to what I said to Richard. Unless we stand up and identify the problem and posit solutions, then nothing moves forward. So I think we've got a solution. And I know that we've got people on board who can see that it works, and we're rolling it out across all of the clients that we work with, and and we think it's viable. Will it be the system that rules the whole industry? I don't know yet. I know that we need something that does a better job than what we've got at the moment, and I don't see a problem with that. Provided that we're looking very carefully, as I said already, at those two fundamental aspects: privacy and security.
Hi, I'm Alice Meadows from Orchid. So I just wanted to follow up a little bit as well. First of all, you had asked about, our breadth of coverage, about what we were looking to do, and in a sneak preview of what I'm going to say after the break, we have actually recently expanded our sort of potential audience, if you like, so that we now say that we are committed to providing identifiers for researchers, scholars, and anyone who participates in the innovation process. So it is it's beyond academia. Basically, is the idea that it's reaching researchers and contributors right across the whole of that space, so into commercial areas as well. And then I also wanted to point out that, as some of you may have seen, we recently introduced our own federated sign-in so that people can now log into their Orchid record using their federated credentials or their Google or Facebook credentials. So just I thought people might be interested.
So there we go. That could be another. That's another piece in the puzzle. Because we work with Orchid, you can sign on using your Orchid. So we're not necessarily we don't want to be in control of the username and password either, for all the reasons that I said. We're quite happy for Orchid to take on that responsibility. So being a federated system, you can work with multiple identity providers.
So just to Richard's question, I don't think there is going to be a single federated system. You've got to let people bring whatever identity they care to for the specific domain that they're operating in. So if I want to use my Amazon account to log into scholarly publishing, I should be able to do that. My Orchid account? Sure. My Google account? Sure. They all have to be treated as members of the federation, but they all have to operate on the same premise.
One of the things I would point out to you as publishers is that you have a choice to make. When you think about, do I want a single social identifier or do I want Orchid? I mean, all the ones that I've heard mentioned so far involve the user self-asserting information. It's not verified by anybody. There's no level of assurance that the person is who they say they are or have published what they've said they did. If you're okay with that, then that's fine. But if you need any more assurance that you're actually talking about Professor Joe Smith of biology at Duke University, then you wouldn't want to use Orchid. You wouldn't want to use Google. You would want to give them the choice to federate with, to join a federation that includes Duke University as an option for them, the account that they want to use. People will always have more than one account. They will always have their social, self-asserted information, and then they'll often, especially at least in our industry, have that one that they're proud of for professional reasons.
Can I just quickly respond to that? You're absolutely right, of course, although one of the things that we're working very hard at in Orchid is creating validated assertions about people who register an Orchid ID. So although you're right that the record holder, the registrant claims their ID themselves, in about 2/3 of cases they do so via their institution who make that assertion for them. So you really can be pretty confident that Professor Joe Bloggs of Duke University really is that person, and by making multiple validated assertions you can become more and more clear, and the idea is that going forward that will be the norm, that most of the information that gets attached to an Orchid record will be asserted by an organisation for which the work is being done or the affiliations being made.
Mm-hmm. Right. I would call that a reputation system. Yeah. And those are very interesting, but it's a very different model from trying to follow a level of assurance.
Right. I'm just saying it's not all going to be self-asserted is the distinction I wanted to make.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't that the point where we actually need crypto? Like you need some kind of signing by either an individual or some institutional entity actually signing it in one way or the other to make sure that this assertion is actually true and not corruptible?
Yes, I mean, So I think if we're talking about that, and we sorry, because we're talking about a blog post which probably not everybody has seen. There were two aspects to that blog post. One was talking about analytics and the other was about identity. Yes, there is a space for a kind of a distributed, effectively federated, I suppose, in some sense, cryptographic signing that lets people assert their identity. I don't know that that scales out in the way that we might need it to for this particular situation. I think that that's ultimately is a sort of a little bit down in the weeds technical detail that is something that, you know, and if what Alice has just said about you know, taking on board kind of sort of notions of how to validate identity within ORCID, or then that's something that belongs on that side of the fence. But yes, it's, you know, it's I think there are other things that blockchain is useful for that we're not touching on anyway.
It doesn't need to be blockchain. I mean, it's just, if you just look at ORCID, it would be enough if like ORCID offered some kind of, I don't know, PGP-based signing process. I mean, yeah.
If you really want to validate people's identity, do a credit card transaction with them for $1 and send them a $10 Amazon gift card. Then you'll know who they are. It's really unnecessary for our industry, but if you know, I don't believe any system out there really knows who people are, right? Who's going out there doing DNA checks on the people who register on their system? Doing a credit card transaction will be just fine.
Interesting discourse here. So it doesn't really matter who anybody really is, right? We're actually conflating two problems here. And one of your earlier slides, Richard, had the idea of attributes and identity. Okay, so sign-on is just my username and password. But the identity, which is codified in the attributes that pertain to the task I'm doing, that's what's important at the moment. And so we're expecting to be able to log in to Google or ORCID or anyplace else and gain access to scholarly publications. Well, the scholarly publication platform knows what domain it's in. A user presents themselves as a Google login or as an ORCID login, but the scholarly platform has to say, all right, I've got to go find out who this person is and what permissions they've got based on where, you know, the service that I'm offering. You disagree?
You're too narrow. A scholarly platform, a journal platform, is just such a small slice of what researchers are doing.
Sure, but it's the delivery platform that's got to make the decision on what it needs in terms of identification management for the user that's presented themselves at their front door, right? And the back end, the federated system, really needs to make that all happen transparently behind the scenes so that the user logs in once with who cares what ID, but they get access to whatever service they're asking for based on the platform's understanding of putting the two together.
Yeah, but the use cases with other systems does require a different level of identity, different use case. So a peer review system, probably more important to know who they really are. A lab, ordering system, even more.
Sure, but when the user logs in, the platform and the infrastructure behind it needs to determine that this user, whatever account they just used to log in, actually has the permissions and the attributes to their identity that enable them to do what they're trying to do, right?
I think it's also Stephanie Dawson from Science Open. I think we also have to keep in mind your first point that a lot of it is about getting enough usage on the content so that somebody can go directly from Google, find the article, actually read the article. And just to share a little bit of our experience with from Science Open, we started out with a system of password and username, login, etc. And when we moved to an OAuth, so you can log in with your Facebook, your LinkedIn, your ORCID account with one click, we saw, I think, between a 5 and 10-fold increase in the number of people actually registering on our platform. So that's, I think, something to also keep in mind as you are trying to balance different things, because, of course, you need to make it easier to get more usage. And I think that, of course, it's different if you're talking about getting people to do peer review and stuff like that, but if we're talking about getting people to read actually your content, I think those kind of systems are super important.
So, and I think that's a very, very important point, and one that maybe I just to make sure that I was completely clear here. We're not trying to replace social logins like that. What in fact, what I'm saying is exactly the opposite. We need to embrace that as an industry, and that's what we've done with our system, because we see that federated aspect, which is effectively saying it's fine for Google to say who you are, or it's fine for your university to say who you are through your federated identity system, through Shibboleth, for example. It's fine to use all of those systems. In fact, we need to use all of those systems, because that's how you will ultimately onboard more users and build a better user experience where you don't have to keep signing on all the time. And that's fundamentally how we will get to that point.
One way I've seen something like this solved is, I'll go back to my LIGO experience, where they wanted a pretty darn low barrier to entry to get people to edit the wiki pages and update the FTE time so that they knew who could be an author on a paper and all that other fun stuff. But when it came to actually accessing the data itself, or better yet, accessing the instruments online, what they had in the back end was, okay, this is a single account, but there's several authentication methods linked to it. If they came in with their social media, sure, they could, their Google ID, they could access the wiki and do whatever they wanted to. But in order to access the equipment, they had to come in with a more seriously vetted identity. The system knew it was the same person, but made that intelligent decision based on how they authenticated what they were actually going to be allowed to access.
Great. Thank you, everybody. This was a terrific first half of our session. I want to thank Richard and Heather for terrific presentations, really thought-provoking. We're going to have the coffee break now, and then we'll be back at 10:15. We have a great second half for you, so we're going to try to start right on time.